Hello, and welcome to the FightNoise video blog. Today we're going to be discussing the incredibly deep lightweight division, a division that has become so deep, so talent-rich, so filled with so many good fighters. I believe there is a need to extend the ranking system to include not just the top 10 ranked fighters, but the top 20 ranked fighters. Eventually, every division in the UFC will be deep enough to warrant this enlarged ranking system, but I think a great place to start would be the lightweight division. And kick it off with adding an additional 10 spots to the ranking system, testing it out, seeing how it works. But I think it'd be a great idea, given how much talent there is even outside the top 10, adding an additional spots 11 through 20 would provide an ability to organize the matchups outside of the top 10 and figure out where people fall and who deserves to be sneaking into the top 10 and next in line to make an appearance on that top 10 list. So, in the spirit of that, I would like to present my picks for numbers 11 through 20 of the lightweight 155-pound division of the UFC, going in reverse order in order to preserve as much of the suspense as possible. We'll be starting with number 20. My pick for number 20 coming right up, Diego Sanchez. A fighter who's probably, if he continues to compete at lightweight, that still remains to be seen. Looks like he has options at a few different weight classes. If he remains at lightweight, he's probably going to be moving up in the rankings very rapidly. When he has competed at lightweight, which hasn't been too much, he's been very successful. His lone losses to either champions or former champions, BJ Penn, and of course the most recent fight with Gilbert Melendez. So that puts him, at around 20 in my opinion, and soon to move up if he continues to compete at lightweight. Number 19, Jorge Masvidal, guy who competed very successfully outside the UFC for a very long time, a relatively young veteran in the sport. Tons of big wins, tons of experience under his belt, very well-rounded. He really showed off his much-improved wrestling and grappling against Michael Chiesa in the very impressive victory against the Ultimate Fighter winner. Had a very close loss recently to Rustem Khabilov, but remains a very dangerous fighter in the lightweight division and definitely deserves to have a spot in the rankings somewhere and is a relevant fighter who could also be moving up in the not-too-distant future and still very young considering his experience level. Moving on to number 18, we have Melvin Guillard. Melvin Guillard's one of those guys who could beat anyone in the UFC and possibly lose to anyone in the UFC. He has the talent and the ability to literally beat anyone, to knock out pretty much anyone in the UFC. He also, in the past, has displayed a lack of consistency. Which Melvin Guillard are we currently going to be treated to? Has he got his training situation together such that he'll be able to bring the kind of focus that he can bring and that we've seen him bring to his next fight and his future fights? If he does, another guy that's going to be vaulting up the rankings, another guy who could still be fighting for a title in the not-too-distant future if he rattles off a few wins and displays a little more consistency. But definitely one of the most talented guys in not only the lightweight division but all of the UFC. Moving on to 17, we have Evan Dunham, a guy who's been in the UFC for a long time, had a great run at the title a few years ago after very, very close battles with Sean Shirk and some wins over some top-level guys. And then had a few losses, but his last 3 losses are all to currently ranked top 10 guys, one of which was a loss to Rafael dos Anjos, who many believed, including myself, including company president Dana White, was a poor decision. Many believed Evan Dunham won that fight over currently, I think, 6th or 7th ranked Rafael dos Anjos. So if you consider that a possible win, that really says a lot. His other 2 losses also to top 10 ranked fighters, TJ Grant and Donald Cerrone most recently. So I think that puts him right around 17, definitely on the list, definitely a guy who's still relevant and still someone to watch. Number 16, we got Pat Healy, who was recently in the top 10 and just recently fell out of the top 10 after the most recent loss to Bobby Green, I believe. But a guy who obviously was a very successful competitor in Strikeforce and then came into the UFC and surprised a lot of people by beating Jim Miller, who still is currently ranked in the top 10. I think he is number 10 right now. Moving on to 15, we have Rustam Khabilov. Rustam Khabilov, very impressive and interesting skill set, very diverse, interesting grappling, the throws, the suplexes, and most recently a very solid win over a very well-rounded veteran in Jorge Masvidal, and I think a win that puts him right in the mix for getting close to that top 10 rankings. He has a fight coming up with Rafael Dos Anjos. If he wins that fight, I think there's no question he'll jump into the top 10 rankings, but that's certainly a very tough fight. Number 14, we have Bobby Green, who I just mentioned, who recently defeated Pat Healy. Looked very impressive in that fight. Guy's obviously has tremendous talent and great, very unorthodox striking, but also showed in that fight that he can deal with a high-level grappler in Healy. That combination is dangerous, and a guy who is definitely going to continue, I think, only to get better. Moving on to 13, we have Jamie Varner, a guy who was a big name in the WEC before it basically was absorbed by the UFC, came into the UFC and had a little bit of a career renaissance, if you can call it that for a guy who is as young as Jamie Varner is. But the win over Edson Barboza made a lot of noise. He took a very quick turnaround, short notice fight against against Joe Lauzon, where he looked fantastic in the first round. Went on to lose that fight to a late fight submission, but many felt that because of the short notice, perhaps his conditioning was not quite up to par, and Lauzon, as Lauzon is so good at, was able to take him to deep water and take advantage once Varner had lost his gas tank. Moving on to, a guy who's really shown that he has the skill set to very well-rounded skill set to beat possibly anyone in the division and possibly challenge for a title one of these days. Number 12, we have Gleison Tibau, a guy who's been on an absolute tear recently. Has had probably a dozen or so fights in the UFC. He's been in the organization forever, and recently has really seemed to turn it on and rattle off wins against some top competition, including the previously mentioned Jamie Varner. That puts him squarely at the top of my 11 through 20 rankings, near the top of the 11 through 20 rankings, and a guy who, with essentially one more win, should be sneaking into the top 10 rankings, I would imagine. I'm not sure who he's booked to fight next, but it would certainly make sense for it to be a top 10 fighter, given his recent success and the level of competition he's been beating in his past 3 or 4 fights. Now, the number 11 pick, the number 1 pick, in a sense, on this list of 11 through 20, Edson Barboza. Might be a little bit of a strange pick to some people. He had the loss to Jamie Varner a few fights ago, but I feel like since that fight, he has looked more consistent, more impressive than Jamie Varner. If you take away that loss to Varner, it's really the only loss he's had in his past 7 or 8 fights in the UFC, and he's looked incredibly dominating in all of his wins over very stiff competition. Most recently, the win over Danny Castillo. Had a tough first round. Castillo caught him with some punches, but regrouped, and executed an excellent game plan. Has excellent takedown defense and seems to have some really effective counter wrestling and counter grappling, and has some of the best striking in the whole sport. Might have the best kicks in the sport, very possibly. Certainly the best leg kicks, with the possible exception of Jose Aldo. But I think Edson Barboza may well have stolen that title from Aldo. So I have him at number 11 as the guy closest to sneaking into the top 10 rankings. He should have a fight coming up, I believe, against a top 10 opponent. And if he wins that fight, you better believe he's going to find himself right back in the mix for a title shot in the not-too-distant future. So many great fighters in this division, though. A few other names that are worth mentioning. Guys, I didn't make it onto this 11 through 20, but we're very close. Abel Trujillo, very excited to see him fight Bobby Green coming up. That is a guy who has grown tremendously by leaps and bounds since his debut in the UFC, and his debut was impressive, so that's really saying a lot. Anthony Njokuani, a guy who I've been a fan of for a long time, really showed off improved takedown defense against Roger Bowling in his most recent fight, and obviously the guy's got great striking. Miles Jury has been winning nonstop for a long time now. Takanori Gomi is still relevant, seems to have really had a kind of career renaissance in the UFC in his past few fights. Michael Johnson has looked fantastic. John McDessie is one of the best strikers in the lightweight division. Ross Pearson is always a factor, and definitely a guy who can come in there and get some quality wins. And Joe Lauzon, of course, is still coming off the win over Mac Danzig. Still a guy who is relevant. Still a guy who can bring us some quality fights and quality wins in the UFC. So that's my pick for 11 through 20. I suggest we enhance the rankings, expand the rankings to include 11 through 20, starting with the lightweight division because it has gotten insanely deep, and test it out, see how it works. If it works, we'll use it in the rest of the weight classes too. No reason to just have a top 10. I think a top 20 would be useful and relevant, and we should start with 155. That's the Fight Noise video blog. Thanks so much for watching.